The topic for today is the God of the whosoever. The God for the whosoever. So that's the message I would like to explore this morning. So I want to start with telling you a story. One Sunday morning, a 9-year-old boy called Joshua skipped to church, because we all skip to church, don't we? But this boy, he skipped to church and he was going for this long walk, and his mother told him that if he skipped church, he'd miss his chance to see Jesus. So there's skipping and then there's skipping. So if he skipped church too much, he'd miss Jesus altogether. But Joshua had been going to church his whole life. He'd never seen Jesus before, so he didn't think he'd be missing much. Joshua's walk took him across town into this new area. He noticed that the houses were much bigger, much nicer than his part of town. And Joshua eventually came across a beautiful church, the most incredible church building he had ever seen. The steeple alone seemed to be as tall as a mountain. And he noticed that the cars in the parking lot were very fancy, and the people going into the church all wore very nice clothes, and he didn't see any people from his neighborhood there. This must be the church where Jesus goes, Joshua thought to himself. It's so big. It's so nice. And as he walked closer to this big church, he could hear music coming from inside. He remembered his mother talking about how angels sing to Jesus in heaven. Wow, I reckon the angels must be singing to Jesus in this big church. And he walked up the steps, through the large front doors. He entered into the sanctuary, amazed at its grandeur. This must be where Jesus is, Joshua whispered to himself. And he noticed an empty seat at the back of the church. And he scanned the crowds with his eyes so he could find Jesus. At this point, the choir had stopped singing, and a large man in a suit, he tapped Joshua on his shoulder. And the man leaned down and asked Joshua if he could speak with him outside. Outside the church, the man asked him, "Son, where do you live? Where do you come from?" And Joshua told him very politely that he'd come from the other side of town. "Where are your parents?" he asked him. "Well, they're probably at their church right now." "Well, son, I think it's better you go find your parents and go to their church instead." And Joshua was very surprised by this. "But I saw your church, and I knew that Jesus was there, or was here. So I came to see Jesus for myself." "Well, son, I think it best you run along home and go see Jesus in your own church, in your own neighborhood. You cannot stay here." So realizing for the very first time that what this man was trying to say and trying to do, Joshua got a little bit upset. I think I can understand why. "You don't want me to see Jesus," he yelled as he turned and he ran up the street away from this big church. Joshua ended up sitting alone on a sidewalk in tears. And suddenly he heard some footsteps behind him, and he felt a hand on his shoulder, and he turned around and he wiped his eyes and he stared in amazement. Who could it be? It was Jesus. And the Lord smiled at Joshua, gave him a big hug and said, "Don't be too upset, my son. They wouldn't let me in there either." A lot of food for thought in that little story. And I always think of Jesus who told the parables. You can learn so much from a story. So the week before last, I was asked to go to Manx Radio and to share a talk about the Salvation Army. And one of the questions that they asked me at the radio station was, who is the charity for? Who is our charity for? So doing a bit of homework, because I wasn't sure. Did you know who they're for, Rachel? I had to figure this one out. The Salvation Army was set up to further the Christian faith. Surprise, surprise. To further the Christian faith. And B, it was to make the church accessible to the whole community. In other words, to make a church a welcoming place for the whosoever. So A, it's a church to further the Christian faith, and B, to make that church accessible for the whole community, no matter who you are. So when I say the whosoever, it basically means that anyone, anyone is free to access church, no matter if you're rich or poor, academic, uneducated, no matter your ethnic background, your social standing, if you're a sinner or a saint. Everyone can find a place of refuge. Everyone can find a place to belong and to be a part of the family of God. Now, the concept sounds very simple, doesn't it? It sounds straightforward, but William Booth found that this was a bit problematic. So he was an evangelist. We know well from history he was an evangelist. He'd help people find salvation for themselves, and then he would point them back. Go to your local church. Go back to your local church. Unfortunately, in that day, not every church was very accommodating to this idea. So, for example, often alcoholics or homeless people would find salvation. They would then seek out their local church, only to be turned away at the door because they weren't the sort of people they wanted to fill their pews with. These were the type of people that perhaps didn't believe or behave as expected. So they had no place to belong. So I'm going to say that again because I think that's an important point to make. The people didn't believe or behave as expected in that church, so they had no place to belong. I think rather we should look at it this way. Rather, we should allow people to belong first and foremost. And then I think we need to teach what is expected in terms of behavior and belief. What we believe as Christian people before they are turned away. Now, these people back in William Booth's day would return to him heartbroken, dejected, and that was what really triggered the establishment of the Salvation Army halls, a safe place for the rejected, the marginalized, the outcast, the sinners, a place that welcomed the whosoever, with a willingness to journey alongside everyday normal people. And I like this term, down-to-earth movement. We're a down-to-earth movement that has seen the transformation of countless lives. And I think we can be very proud to be associated to the Salvation Army because it's done an amazing job. But we need to make sure we continue to bring that amazing transformation in people's lives. Now, in our Bible reading today that Ian so kindly read for us, Matthew 26, verses 6 to 16, we come across the story of Jesus mixing with the wrong sort of people. And this upset a lot of people. Stephen Cottrell, in his book, The Things He Did, is quoted saying this: "He was a very down-to-earth God, a compassionate, on-your-side God. It drove the God professionals mad. This included the scribes and the Pharisees. They had the qualifications, they had the breeding. But who was this Jesus who mixed with sinners?" Who was this Jesus who mixed with sinners? Thankfully, Jesus didn't care about what people said or thought about him. He wasn't trying to please people. He was trying to please his Father God. And Matthew 26, Jesus is having a meal with Simon. And what's really significant about this interaction is that we learn that he was a leper. He's been cured from leprosy, but he was an outcast. He was rejected for being unclean. It wasn't the done thing to be hanging out with somebody who's had leprosy. This was a social taboo, hanging out with him, let alone eating with Simon. And in this scenario, Jesus is also eating with his followers, his disciples. And within this group, we find there's Judas Iscariot, the one who will betray him later which will lead to Jesus' death. And then in comes a woman off the streets, and in Jesus' day, there was the social expectation that needed to be upheld. Women had prohibitions, especially when it came to interacting with men in religious environments. Nonetheless, this woman comes into the presence of Jesus. She anoints his head with expensive oil. I just imagine the oil dripping off his brow. And this outrages Jesus' disciples. They're outraged. What's going on here? And then we look at the disciples' reaction. There's disbelief of what's going on. Is he going to condone this? Isn't he going to tell her off for interrupting this assembly? Wouldn't he tell her off for wasting this expensive perfume that perhaps she could have sold and given money to the poor. But Jesus permits this interaction. There's no barrier put up here. There's no blockade. Jesus welcomes her into his presence. He welcomes her generous gesture, this expression of her appreciation of him. And there's joy between them. But others in the room are very agitated. They're annoyed of what's going on here. How can Jesus permit this to happen? This woman could have been of ill repute. We don't know. But she's disrupting this very important meal with Jesus. What right does she have to come in here and disrupt this gathering? And when I reflect on the attitudes of the disciples in this story or the scenario, I think they may have been a little self-righteous, unfairly judging the woman with the anointing oil, rather seeing her as an inconvenience. But Jesus welcomes the whosoever. And the story highlights the importance of not ostracizing the poor, the marginalized, the stigmatized in society, because Jesus finds value in every human being. We are all God's creation. Yes, some people have made better choices than others, but that doesn't give us the right to decide who is worthy and who is unworthy to come into the presence of Jesus. And I really believe that the disciples were embarrassed and they perhaps realized the errors of their way, and it made them uncomfortable, this uncomfortable truth that they had to face up to. And Jesus' attention, and perhaps the church in general, it's not only reserved for the religious few or the chosen people. Jesus' attention is for the whosoever, who seek him out for themselves. It's not just for the religious elite. As a core, as a church community, I think there's a challenge for us here to make sure that we continue to create an environment that is gracious and patient and understanding, to remember that not everyone will think and act like we think and act like us. Sometimes there will be those who come into our presence who don't sort of hit that mark of our personal expectations, our personal standards. And I guess the challenge for us is not to become self-righteous or judgmental in attitude, but to follow the example of Jesus, who accepted the unloved, the unpopular, who gave them a chance to meet with him for themselves. A key Bible verse I came to was Luke 6 verse 31, which says, "Do to others as you would like them to do to you." And the Message translation puts it this way: here is a simple rule of thumb for behavior. Ask yourself what you want people to do for you, then grab the initiative and do it for them. If you only love the lovable, do you expect a pat on the back? For run-of-the-mill sinners do that. If you only help those who help you, what do you expect? A medal. So I love that translation. Do to others as you would want them to do to you. Treat people the way you want to be treated. How about you, church? Are you ready to love like Jesus loved? What a challenge for us. Are you ready to love the whosoever?